As you can already see from the title of my presentation, my research focuses anyways on the two things that you aren't supposed to mention over polite dinner conversations: politics and religion. And today's discussion will be what for many people might be a particularly unsavory topic, namely the relationship between religion and right-wing populism on both sides of the Atlantic. And I will also share a couple of slides on that with you. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Exactly. So that's on. And we are probably going to structure the presentation, the session in 2 parts. For the first half an hour, 25 minutes, half an hour or so, I'll give you a bit of an overview over my research. And then in the second half, we will open it up to discussion and address some of the questions that already have been submitted, but really also do feel free to think about questions as I speak, and then to bring in, I really hope for an open discussion. You can also tell me how I'm wrong in all of the things I'm saying. So let's jump into the topic: defenders of the faith, right-wing populism, and religion in Western Europe and the United States. But before really going into the deep academic part of that, I actually thought to start by taking you onto a little imaginary journey through a couple of Western cities in these last few years. And let's begin this journey in my own home country. As you probably noticed from the accent by now, I'm German. And I want to take you in particular to Dresden, to Germany's beautiful capital of Baroque. And I just want you to imagine yourself walking through the streets of Dresden on a cold winter evening, and suddenly coming across this huge crowd of people gathered around the Frauenkirche, the main Protestant church, several thousand of them, and they are singing church hymns, they are carrying candles, and some are carrying oversized crosses. And then imagine that the second stop of our journey takes us to Paris in France, where once again we come across a huge crowd of several thousand people, this time gathered around the statue of a Catholic saint and preparing to march in the saint's veneration through the streets of Paris. And then finally, let us imagine that our journey takes us to the other side of the Atlantic, and more particularly to Washington, D.C., where yet again we meet a crowd of several thousand people, and they too are carrying crosses. They're carrying Jesus Saves flags, and they're blaring Christian music from their speakers. Now, what is interesting about these 3 events is that none of them took place in the context of a religious service, procession, or any other form of religiously organized event or gathering, but that all 3 were organized by right-wing populist movements. The first in Dresden by the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident, Pegida. The second by the Front National, what is now called the Rassemblement National in France, in their annual gathering in the honor of Joan of Arc. And the third were scenes that are probably terribly familiar to many of you from the pro-Trump protests around the US Capitol earlier this year, which ended up in these deathly riots. And these 3 events are actually representative of 2 broader trends that we can currently observe throughout many Western democracies. On the one hand, we see the rise of right-wing populism, that in many countries is no longer a fringe movement, but can form governments and majorities. And then on the other hand, we see the resurgence of references to religion, and in particular to Christianity, in the political debate of many Western countries that for a long time we have thought were already secularized, or at least on the path towards further secularization. And given the nature of the 3 events I just described to you, one may now, of course, be very much tempted to think that these 2 trends are actually part of one and the same reactionary backlash, so to speak, of conservative religion against the advance of secular liberal society. However, as tempting as such an interpretation may seem, perhaps in particular to a secular educated mind, at least in the American and European context, a closer analysis of the relationship between right-wing populism and religion suggests that reality is actually a bit more complicated than that. Because if we look at the numbers, we actually see that, for instance, yes, Donald Trump was incredibly popular with white evangelicals, both in 2016 and in 2020, winning almost 80, 81, 82% of their support. But surveys also show that the very same evangelicals also say that they perceive Trump to be the least religious GOP candidate in recent history. And he was actually also met by quite significant opposition from parts of the white evangelical clergy, which traditionally is very conservative. And if we look to places like Europe, we can see that the situation here is even more complex, because here we see that supporters of right-wing populist movements, in fact, often tend to be disproportionately irreligious. And we can see that the very example of the picture that you can still see here of the demonstrations in Dresden, because there was actually a survey taken on that evening. And it turned out that of these people running around with the oversized crosses and singing Christmas carols, over 80% self-identified as atheist or irreligious, and only a tiny minority self-identified as Christian in a country that is still at least nominally 60 to 70% Christian. And we can actually see that that is not just a special case here, but true throughout Europe, where things like church attendance are actually one of the strongest empirical predictors for not voting right-wing populism. And some scholars therefore even speak of religious immunity or religious vaccination effect of religion against right-wing populism. So the question is now, of course, how can we explain these paradoxical expressions of the relationship between the rise of right-wing populism and their references to religion, and then some of these more confusing data points? And what I try to do in my research is precisely that, and to look at this question, approach this question basically in 4 steps. First, I try to look at the social origins of right-wing populism, trying to understand why is this happening right now, what is driving this, and to what extent are the developments on both sides of the Atlantic actually comparable. Then the second step is to look at how religion fits into this context. What do right-wing populists actually mean when they speak about Christian identity, and how might that be different to earlier references to Christianity in politics? Third is then to look at how the strategy works out in practice. How do Christian communities, for instance, react to these references to religion in different countries? And then fourth, what does this mean for the role of the church in society going forward? What does this mean for the role of religion and politics going forward? And which factors shape our future in what ways? But first things first, let's talk about the social origins of right-wing populism. Where is this surge of right-wing populism coming from? And here my main argument is very much that the surge of right-wing populist movements in Western democracies is to a large extent the consequence of the emergence of a new social cleavage centered around the question of identity, of how do we define national identity, who are the we, and who are the others. And for all those of you who had better things to do in their 20s than getting a social science PhD, very briefly, social cleavages refer to the main social divides within a society that shape and define the political system and the parties that populate it. And historically in Western democracies, the two main defining social cleavages are the two that you can see on the slide, with on the one hand, the economic cleavage between workers and capitalists, between state interventionism and the free market. That's the class struggle in many ways, if you'd like to think of it in these ways. And then on the other hand, you had the religious or cultural cleavage between social conservatism and social liberalism. And as a result, for most of the 20th century, Western politics were dominated, on the one hand, by questions about economic redistribution, taxation, and class relations. And then on the other hand, by social issues such as abortion, church-state relations, and sexual freedom. And historically, we could also place most of our political parties pretty straightforwardly on this 2x2 metrics, because they were defined in relation to these big social divides. But what is interesting is that if we look at right-wing populist movements, it's much harder to place them in that. They don't really fit this 2x2 matrix anymore, because in many ways they actually end up on both ends of both of these traditional divides. So if we look at the economic cleavage, we can see that many, for instance, Northern European populists or the early AfD in Germany or the Tea Party were very much free trade, anti-tax movements and embraced a very neoliberal view of economics. But what is interesting is that if we look a bit more closely, we also see more and more right-wing populists ending up on the blue-collar side of the divide. We think about Donald Trump's protectionism in the United States. We think about many right-wing populist movements embracing quite, in many ways, traditionally left-wing position when it comes to welfare policies, with examples like the Front National or the Rassemblement National in France, in many ways embracing more left-wing positions when it comes to economic policies than, say, the Socialist Party in France. And perhaps even more surprising than this volatility when it comes to the economic crisis, economic cleavage, is that many right-wing populists actually also end up on both sides of the traditional cultural or moral cleavage. That might be surprising, because we traditionally tend to think of right-wing populists as these particularly conservative, particularly reactionary movements. But if we look a bit closer, we can see that Geert Wilders in the Netherlands says we are the real defenders of gay rights, LGBT rights as right-wing populists against conservative Islam. You have people in the AfD in Germany who are saying we are the real defenders of women's rights. You have the Front National saying we are the real defenders of state-church separation. And of course, whether you think that this is authentic or not in Europe is entirely up to you, but the very flexibility of right-wing populist movements on these issues shows that right-wing populists' core, the main divide in relation to which they define themselves, lies elsewhere. It's not about economics, and it's not about traditional morality. And indeed, if we look at the polling data over the last couple of years, we really can see that it's concerns about identitarian questions, about immigration, national culture, national identity, that trump economic, social, and moral concerns. And this really suggests that the erosion, in many ways, of traditional identities in our societies through processes like secularization, the erosion of class identity, individualization, that the disappearance of these traditional group identities may have led, in a way, to a crisis of identity, in particular among losers of globalization, but also more broadly, and a consequent rise of a new divide, which pits two visions of how, in this identity vacuum in many ways, we are to define identity. And these two visions are, on the one hand, a communitarian approach of a clearly defined national identity based on inherited group identity markers such as ethnicity, culture, history, institutions, or language. And then on the other hand, a much more globalist approach focused on universalism, multiculturalism, and diversity that in many ways embraces group identities, primarily for minority populations, but favors much more individualist identities for the majority population. I'm, of course, not the only one who talks about this new divide. Many of you will have heard of David Goodhart, who tried to term this the divide between somewheres and anywheres. Others referred as the divide between closed society and open society, nationalists and globalists, communitarians against cosmopolitans. But whatever you might want to call it, one common feature in many Western societies was that traditional party systems for a long time seemed ill-equipped to deal with a new political fault line, because they often ended up on one and the same side of the new identity cleavage, with many center-left parties having replaced traditional communitarian instinct of the working class parties with a new liberal cosmopolitanism focusing, for instance, on meritocracy, minority rights, and environmentalism rather than a traditional class solidarity. Whereas on the right, we saw the rise of an economically neoliberal, but in many ways socially much more libertarian and pro-immigration conservatism. And the result in many societies was a gap of representation. And it is now, by making national identity and immigration the centerpiece of their agenda, that right-wing populists try to seek it to politicize the new divide and to tap into this market niche for communitarian identity politics in a way, with their own form of right-wing or white identity politics that, in a way, like the identity politics of the left, is primarily focused on predefined traits such as race, culture, sexuality, or gender, but that tries to reverse the dynamics and saying that they are defending not the rights of minority populations, but the identity of the majority. And the question is now, of course, how does religion fit into this? And here my second argument is that right-wing populists really primarily deploy or use Christianity as a cultural identity marker in the context of this new right-wing identity politics. They use Christian symbols and Christian language, but increasingly remain distant from Christian values, beliefs, and institutions. And to try better understand this dynamic, try to think of the right-wing populist worldview basically as a triangular relationship between, on the one hand, the pure, the good, the homogeneous people. These are the good guys. And then this is the us in a way. And then this us is threatened by a set of two others. On the one hand, you have the internal other. That's the corrupted liberal elite that is threatening the identity of the us from the inside. These are all the cosmopolitans. And then on the other hand, you have the external other. And what is interesting is that this external other is increasingly defined in cultural, civilizational, and specifically in religious terms, and more particularly, especially in Europe and the US, in Islamophobic terms. And it is really only given this religious definition of the other that Christianity may now appear as an analogous cultural identifier of the us. But what this is not necessarily a return of religion or religiosity to politics, but much rather a culturalization, perhaps even a secularization of the very concept of religion itself. Religion here really only as a way of identifying the national community. In a way, it's a dissociation of religious belief from religious belonging, of religion as a faith from religion as a cultural identifier. And I could see that very much in my own research. So all of this, what I'm telling you, is actually based on a big research project that I've done over the last couple of years, where I interviewed almost 150 right-wing populist leader, mainstream party politicians, and faith leaders in Germany, France, and the US. And one of the questions I ask everybody is, how do you actually define Christian identity? And it was striking that when I asked this question to right-wing populist leaders, to mainstream party politicians or to clergy, they would all talk about theological concepts. They would tell me about sinfulness, about the Trinity, the resurrection, the second coming of Christ. By contrast, when I asked the very same question to right-wing populist leaders, they would start talking about cultural aspects. They would start telling me about architecture, music, tradition, history, geography, and crucially, almost all right-wing populist leaders would also start talking about Islam in the definition of Christianity, and always in a negative way. They would always say, like, we are Christian because we have a church in the village and not a mosque. We are Christian because we celebrate Christmas and not Ramadan. We are Christian because we aren't Muslim in a way. And none of the mainstream party leaders or clergy mentioned Islam in such ways. And they're very often really open, the right-wing populist leaders, about that. So just to give you a few quotes here, one high-level AfD leader told me quite openly that in the AfD, the consensus is that when we say Christian or Occident, we mean it in historical and cultural terms rather than in theological terms. It's about defending our culture against other civilizations and the threat of Islam. A very prominent leader in the Front National similarly said that the religious question will necessarily be central, but it will be in relation to the question of political Islam. And perhaps in relation to political Islam, there will be a will to defend what defines us. And when it comes to what defines us, well, then it's still hard to avoid Christian identity. But when asked whether this was about faith or something different, that person also said, oh, clearly, this is rather something cultural. And even in the US, where religion is still so much more of an important part of the of right-wing politics more broadly, one leader of the Trump campaign said to me very clearly, taking back our country now doesn't mean Christianity in the way that it meant in the 80s. Now it means nationalism. So it's less religious and more political. There's no doubt about that. And what is perhaps most striking to me was that under the surface of this, in a way, secularized identitarian references to Christianity as a source of belonging, of cultural identity, there was often quite explicit opposition to Christianity as a faith, as a religious faith. So one AfD politician, for instance, said to me, who was herself Christian, told me that there are many people in the AfD who outwardly say that Christianity is extremely important to them, who say that they are Christian themselves, but who internally always fought the Christians in the party. They really want to destroy us. For these people, Christianity is really a religion from the Near East, which does not fit into Germany. Another leader from the Front National told me that the Christian contingent became marginalized in the AfD, so that for that person, it was a drama of conscience, because as a Christian, they felt they were denied the right to voice their opinion within the party. And even in the US, a White House official told me that Steve Bannon, as representative of the populist right, was really trying to get evangelicals out of the White House, whereas evangelicals tried to get him out in return. So we really see, in a way, this clash between a traditional Christian right and a new, more secular populist right. So in some, we can really see that right-wing populist policies in Europe are often Christian, primarily to the extent that they are anti-Islam, that it's more about cultural identity than about faith and theology. And if we start thinking of it in these terms, then a lot of things start to make sense. It starts to make sense that the Front National is venerating a Catholic saint while holding anti-clerical positions on laicite. It starts to make sense that secular Pegida is carrying crosses around secular Dresden. It starts to make sense that Geert Wilders references the Netherlands Judeo-Christian whilst defying Christian teaching on virtually all topics from refugees to gay marriage. And it even starts to make sense to have with Donald Trump a thrice divorced, formerly pro-choice businessman with little exhibited biblical knowledge, but several alleged extramarital affairs, to become the savior of Christian America, if Christian America is primarily a cultural rather than a religious or moral concept. But now the question is, of course, how does this strategy work out in practice? How do Christian communities actually react to this? And it's actually quite striking that if you look at the numbers, this strategy is actually most successful, especially in Europe, amongst voters and among irreligious voters and non-practicing cultural Christians, whereas practicing Christians remain comparatively immune to such appeal. As I said, this is particularly true in Europe, where in the literature we have a lot of papers at the moment coming out looking at this religion gap or religious immunity. So here you have the data on the slide from Germany, where you can see that the AfD scores on average about twice as high among irreligious voters than they do among Protestants and Catholics. We see similar developments throughout Europe. In France, the Front National or the Liga in Italy have traditionally underperformed among Catholics and tend to do even worse among those who attend church. To be sure, the picture is, of course, very different and much more complicated in the US, precisely because Trump did so extremely well and continues to do so extremely well amongst white evangelical Christians. But even here, it's interesting that during the Republican primaries, when he started out with his campaign, he too actually performed best among those evangelicals who never attend church. And he actually underperformed among frequent churchgoers. So religion here really seems to be able to be both a fuel to right-wing populism in some ways, but in some ways it can also be a barrier to right-wing populist success, which of course now raises the question, which factors determine that? And my research has shown that two factors in particular play, sorry, these were just the numbers on Trump during the primaries, showing the negative correlation between church attendance and voting for Trump in 2016. But as for the factors that determine success or lack thereof of right-wing populists among Christian communities, two factors stand out in particular. On the one hand, the availability of Christian alternatives in the mainstream party system, and secondly, the behavior of institutional churches. So first, the behavior of mainstream political parties, and in particular, the availability of a credible Christian alternative. Here, the logic is very much that Christian voters usually are already bound to traditional conservative or Christian democratic parties because of the traditional religious cleavage. And that if such an electoral alternative is available, as is, for instance, the case in a country like Germany, where you have a strong Christian democratic party, then these voters are simply unavailable to the populist right. However, if such an alternative is lacking or taken over by a right-wing populist movement, as one might argue has happened in the United States, then the religion gap breaks down because there's a perception of having no alternative to that. And I could talk much more about that, but I want to finish on the second factor, because that is actually much more overlooked in the literature, and that is really the role of the churches, and in particular their ability to create a social taboo around the populist right. So if we look, for instance, to countries like Germany, we see that mainstream churches there have been able to erect a quite powerful social taboo around voting AfD by positioning themselves very clearly in the pro-immigration camp, by, as you can see on the picture here, demonstrating at AfD party conferences with slogans such as "Our cross is no swastika," or by excluding AfD politicians from speaking at church events. The German churches really have become some of the party's most robust public adversaries, and as a result, affection for the new right is associated with significant social costs among church members. And we can see similar developments in countries like France, Italy, or Austria, where scholars have found, for instance, a Pope Francis effect, showing that whenever the Pope speaks out in favor of migrants, support for immigration goes up among church-going Catholics, and support for instance, the Front National or the Liga go down. However, if faith leaders, for whatever reason, are unable or unwilling to create such a taboo, it seems like that this vaccination effect or immunization effect of religion, again, seems to break down or weakened. So interestingly, these are, for instance, the example of the United States. And there are, of course, very different factors playing into there. But in the US, it was actually very interesting because in many ways, there were a lot of religious leaders and even clergy who were very skeptical of Trump. So it's not necessarily just about theology. But unlike in Europe, the skepticism in the elite did not translate into the same social taboo against the populist right for two reasons. First, because of structures. There was a lack of hierarchies that meant that no single religious body or even person could speak for Christianity in the same way that an Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope or the Conference of German Protestant Bishops could do that. In the US, that's simply not the case because of the diversity of the religious landscape. But the second factor is also an unwillingness to speak up. And that is primarily linked to a fear of losing influence with the powerful on the one hand, on the side of the clergy, losing influence in politics, but also fear of losing jobs and fellowships within their congregations, on the other hand, because of the way that American clergy is paid and employed. And to be sure, a lot of these fears are not unfounded. There's a lot of data showing that outspoken reactions of the churches, for instance, in Germany, come at a risk. They may contribute, for instance, to further social exclusion or even the radicalization of far-right supporters, as well as to a certain politicization of religion. However, they also evidence that there is still a tremendous potential for faith authorities, for faith leaders, to shape the role of religion in politics and how religion is used in politics, even at the times of secularization. I'm aware that I'm running out of time here, so instead of leaving you with conclusions, I'm just going to leave you here with a couple of open questions, but we'll obviously also address many of the questions that you have, but just as food for thought to think about is whether the emergence of right-wing populism is a threat or corrective to an old party system that is based on political cleavages, political cleavages, whether religion is a barrier or fuel to the surge of right-wing populism, and whether the future of faith in society is really a sacralization of the secular, what we are seeing at the moment, or not rather a secularization of the sacred. So what are we seeing at the moment? I'm going to leave it here because I don't have all the answers, but nor does the Donald. But I'm really looking forward to the discussion with all of you. And I'll stop the screen here so I can see you all better. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. I'll start with a question that was submitted before the event. There is a long and recent history of religion being used to justify colonization and oppression. Ian McKinnon of University of Coventry has recently explored the possibility that a Scottish community threatened with eviction in the 19th century clearances was led to believe by the church that their oppression was a result of their inherent wickedness. To what extent have you found the opposite, i.e. those in power or in populist movements justify prejudice or oppression through and or have their actions reinforced by their interpretation of Christianity? And what implications does this have for Christian communities in Europe?
Yes, exactly. I think it's a very good question. And I think it's very clear, like in many ways what I'm describing here is not entirely new. Religion has been used as a way to, it's been politicized for millennia, has been used as a way to exclude people for millennia. And I think in this respect, it's nothing new that what the populist right is doing there. What I think is interesting though, and where I see a change to what has happened maybe, and also what is happening, for instance, in countries like Poland, is how open right-wing populists are in saying that they take, in trying to dissociating in a way Christian identity from Christian belief or belonging, and saying that of course we don't go to church, of course we don't believe in any of these things, of course we are atheists, but we take this identity of Christianity or Christianism as a source of belonging. So this, in a way, very open attempt to secularize religion and to dissociate religion as a cultural identity marker from religion as a faith with religious institutions. And I think that is a new development, and that is also something for faith communities to think about that debate as they respond to the populist right.
Thank you. Just gonna take one off the chat now. So do you think there is a crossover between your work and that of social psychology, such as Jonathan Haidt's work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great question, because Jonathan Haidt is a good friend and also one of my favorite authors. And I think absolutely it plays a big role, because in a way, what we are witnessing here is also, and I think Jonathan Haidt speaks very well to that. I don't want to summarize that too much, because all of you can read that, and he can do it much better than I do. But basically, that we are moving towards away from traditional politics and much more towards this identity politics, where we stop talking about issues in many ways, but we are talking about forms of identity. The problem being that you can't really dissociate the person from the position anymore. The problem being that you really attack the other person. And this right-wing identity politics is really a quite extreme form of that. But yeah, I'm also happy if you have like more specific questions on that. And I mean, people are also obviously welcome to elaborate on their questions if they want to. Happy to talk more about that.
Is the support of the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the US for Trump an aberration from the RC leaders in Europe?
In many ways, yes and no. I mean, like, one could obviously also say that it's the church in Poland is similar in its support for the populist rights movement and leadership there. But what is interesting for Roman Catholic Church is that on the one hand, the American bishops say, we are the most conservative, we are the big defenders of Catholic traditionalism. And on the other hand, they contradict the Pope and question the Pope's authority on many of these things. They question the authority of most of their brethren in Europe on that. So it's very interesting to have this development, but it is, of course, to some extent, not necessarily, I want to say understandable, but what I hear more, and I think what is a big difference in listening to Roman Catholic leaders in the US compared to Europe, is that in the US you have much more of a, how should I put it, almost a persecution complex. The idea that there's a real feeling of being threatened by what they perceive a very secular democratic party. Whether that's true or not is very different. But because you have this two-party system in a way, and because religion is so polarized, they feel really threatened and almost like feeling there's no other opportunity as to support the populist right. And there's almost like this panic of a persecution effect, which you don't have to the same extent in Europe for a number of reasons that, again, I'm happy to go into. But yes.
Thank you. What do you think the relationship between populism and flattery is?
Flattery. I mean, it's a good question. It's a bit the question that is like obviously a big problem for people like me who try to study very contentious concepts such as populism and religion, is how do you define populism? What do we actually mean by populism? And the problem is that most of the time when we talk about populism, we see it, what in German is called a Kampfbegriff. It's a very politicized idea, and we never call people we like populists. We always call people we dislike populists, and thereby, in this respect, if you use it as a politicized way, then obviously flattery plays into it, of saying, you, the people, are pure and homogeneous and great, and you are the best, and all of these others are terrible. But I try to stick with a more theoretical, in a way, academic definition of populism that is really this triangular relationship of really trying to understand that populism, in a way, is really going after this tension in liberal democracy between liberal and democracy, if that makes sense. Between, on the one hand, liberalism, that is to protect minorities and the rights of minorities, also against the majority, and then democracy on the other hand, which is to protect to have the rule of the majority. And right-wing populists in many ways just want to get rid of the liberal and just want to be very, very democratic at the expense of minorities, which in some ways makes it a bit more clear where they stand on the political spectrum. They're not inherently fascist necessarily, and they're not necessarily pejoratively one side or the other. I think they may just be just as dangerous as many politicized definitions put it, but I think it's often good to really understand what's actually behind that. Yeah, I mean, as I say, like, also, if people want to ask their own question or like follow up, they're very welcome. Even to put your video on so I can see whether I'm responding in completely the wrong way or whether I'm actually addressing the question you're asking.
Yeah, so if you do want to ask by video, just let us know, and then we can activate that for you. Sort of leading on from the last question, do you think that populism is inherently dishonest?
No. I mean, it's again, it goes a bit to what I just said about what do we mean with populism. If we mean with populism generally just people we disagree with, or people who are really unsavory in politics, or even people who are like we might perceive as fascist or racist, which is all really not very nice at all, then yes. But if you go with a traditional definition of populism. And let me just share the graph again. Here we go, is really this idea of defending the will of the majority of the pure people against the set of two others. And actually, one thing that we often forget about populism is we talk a lot about right-wing populism. There's, of course, also left-wing populism. And in many ways, the definition of left-wing populism is within this definition of right-wing populism, because left-wing populism is mainly about the divide between the pure and the homogeneous people and the corrupted elite. They don't have this external other. They don't have the xenophobia aspect of it. But in many ways, there's a lot of overlap. And it's not necessarily, it's not by definition dishonest. Of course, they very often and in practice use very dishonest means, but I don't think, at least with the definition that I'm applying, that populism per se is dishonest. So I would try to avoid normative terms in many ways there.
So I'm just going to go back to the chat questions. Alongside the rise of populism, we also see the rise of strong leaders, for example, Putin or Trump. How important is this link? Yeah,
so I think that's very important when we talk about populism. And it comes a bit back to, again, what I just said about the idea of democracy that is behind that. Because another aspect of our idea of liberal democracy is the importance of institutions, of representation, and of pluralism, that we say, we actually want, our idea of democracy has a lot of different actors, a lot of different voices, and we represent these voices in society, and we also want the dissenting voices in society. So pluralism is really important there. Whereas the, in a way, right-wing populist or generally populist idea of democracy is much more identitarian. It's much more of a, among the philosophers, among you political philosophers, a Rousseauian or even a Carl Schmitt, the German philosopher who justified Nazism in many ways, idea of democracy that allows you to identify a single person or a single party or a single movement with the will of the people, because the people is seen as a homogeneous movement. It's not seen as a pluralistic, heterogeneous thing. It's seen as this like pure homogeneous entity. And because it's pure and homogeneous, it can be easily identified and represented by a single person. And this identitarian idea of democracy therefore makes it much easier for strongmen to say, like, I am the voice of the people. And we don't need all of these institutions like parliament. And it's actually very interesting that this is also the reason why many right-wing populists really like things like direct democracy and referenda, because they can say in many ways, oh yes, you parliament might disagree with me on issue X and Y, but I won this referendum or I won this plebiscite, and therefore I can say, you parliament are undemocratic, I don't need to listen to you. And it's really, in some ways, as much as we might like direct democracy, in some ways it's a much more populist approach to democracy of saying we don't need these intermediary institutions any longer.
Thank you. In popular discourse, politically muscular faith is often associated with the right, conservatism and established powers, especially in the United States and Europe. Yet there is also a long history of faith as a left-wing, progressive, even revolutionary force, especially in South America and Central America. Do you have a sense of the source of this difference between these regions?
Yes, this could be a whole lecture on its own. But I would actually, maybe as a side note, emphasize that I don't actually think that if we look at Europe or the United States, that even that is necessarily true. Of course, we see very often the like white evangelicals for many people are seen as this like byword for being very right-wing or reactionary. But we also should remember that the whole idea of Europe and most of Europe's, in a way, the idea of the welfare state, et cetera, is as much due to Christian democracy as it is to, say, social democracy. And that even in the UK, probably the Labour Party, I think there's a famous quote that the Labour Party owes much more to Methodism than it does to Marxism. And this role of the Christian left in Europe is actually very, very important, continues to be so, which is why we see this like very strong reaction of many European churches against the populist right. That being said, and in the US, I would also say that it's actually quite interesting that we focus on the political right because there's the organized Christian right. But if you think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, 70s, that was mainly driven by Christian preachers. If we think about actually the Democrats' strongest supporters, the most religious group in the United States, if you look at the statistics, who are most practicing, are not white evangelicals, but the African American church. So sometimes I think we overestimate the focus. We focus too much on this particularly organized group that is indeed very right wing, and we underestimate the sources of like progressive movements in Western Europe and the US as well. But I think one other aspect in South America is obviously also that in terms of theology, you had a much greater focus on liberation theology, etc., whereas that was just less important in the historical context in the United States and in Europe. But I still think these movements are there, and especially if we talk about Catholicism, it is a global movement. It is a universal movement, and we can't really draw too much of a distinction between Catholicism in one part of the world and the other, which is why it makes it really difficult. And obviously what is left wing in South America might be perceived as right wing in Europe if you think about issues like abortion, etc. There, in many ways, the Catholic Church in South America is also quite conservative.
So how far do you feel that the current rise in populism is sparked more by economic uncertainty than a genuine support for Christian identity?
Yeah, I think that the economic uncertainty definitely plays an important role. And by the way, when I say there's this new cleavage and the two other cleavages are still important. But what I'm saying is that for a lot of voters, especially those who might have shifted from the center left to the center right, to the far right, for instance, the United States, white working class voters in Europe as well, it's often less about economics and more about identity. So they often also vote for right-wing populist movements, knowing that in terms of economics, this might not help them. And if you ask them what the priorities are, it's most of the time the people who vote for right-wing populist parties don't say it's economic, but they're not actually that concerned about their livelihood. What they are concerned about is the idea of their identity and recognition and respect. The idea of it's not just about money, it's also recognizing them as part of the national community, recognizing their values. And it is true that if you think about this divide between nowheres, somewheres and anywheres, that there is often a way of even classism within this cosmopolitan worldview that many of Europe's center-left parties or even the Democrats in the US have adopted. I don't think that it is by definition so, but sometimes you have these undertones of talking about white working class people, about white trash in the US, about rednecks in the US, about the white van man in the UK. And I think this classism in a way can contribute to support of working class voters to far right parties. But I think in many ways it's less about the actual economic policies than about the sentiment that they are seen as not being respected or being sidelined in the political and social discourse.
Is the threat of religious right-wing populism less potent in countries that have a smaller proportion of religious people, or have populist leaders been able to effectively separate Christian theology and Christian culture to the point where this rhetoric works even on those that are not religious? Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting question, because obviously in many ways, our most sociologists or most political scientists, we had this secularization thesis. It was also in a way almost normative, hoping that or thinking that a lot of the intolerance and othering and really polarization that we have in our societies comes from this irrational idea of religion and like tribalism. And if only people could become rational and enlightened and secular and give up on these crazy religious things, then world would be much better. Everybody would be tolerant. You would all like have a great time, all agreeing about everything. And reality is actually really interesting. There's research coming out about that right now. In many ways, the contrary is the case. In many ways, we see higher polarization in countries that are more secular than in countries that are less secular. We see in many ways that right-wing populists are actually more successful among people who don't go to church, and that religion as a identity marker is more easily used for political gain in a country where there's a greater degree, for instance, of religious illiteracy, where people might not actually connect, where the authority over religion is not that clear because people don't go to church because the churches are weak and not clear. And then to an extent, it's almost like the idea of religion or Christianity or identity is up for grasps because there's no traditional connection with that anymore. And there's actually also a lot of interesting debate at the moment that is more journalistic actually than academic, but the extent to which, because of the absence of traditional faith and institutional churches as a source of common identity, but also of a shared framework of what is called civil religion, of like a framework of debate and commonality to bridge other divides. We have replaced that to an extent with politics becoming religious, that politics is the most important thing in the end because there is nothing beyond politics anymore, and that your political identity of being a Democrat or Republican in the US today is actually more important than your religious identity of being a Christian, a Jew, a Methodist, or a Roman Catholic. And that we actually are not necessarily moving from a conflictuous religious world to a tolerant secular world, but that at least we are having the same level of polarization, political polarization, and that we might actually have greater political polarization in secular societies as in religious ones. But that, again, that is more journalistic debate at the moment. It's an interesting debate to look at.
Thank you. Would you see the nationalist movements in Northern Ireland and Scotland as populist?
I mean, I probably don't know the movements well enough to say so. I'd probably say that they might have populist aspects to them, but I don't necessarily think that they are entirely populist. I don't think that for them this like identity cleavage is the main source of divide, and I don't think that they go in with the same triangular worldview of like there's the liberal elite that we need to get rid of, and then there's this pure and good and homogeneous people. If you think about Scottish nationalism, for instance, in many ways, at least it stylizes itself as more inclusive, for instance, of non-English identities or European identities than English nationalism, for instance. But it's an interesting debate, but I probably wouldn't go as far as calling these movements populist. They might have populist aspects in them, but I wouldn't call them entirely populist.
Okay, so, how critical to this process do you think the individual charismatic leader?
Say it again, sorry.
So how critical to this process is the individual charismatic leader?
I actually think that in many ways it's overestimated. I think it's important, but what we can see is that this potential for a populist leader is there in most Western democracies. And even in countries like Germany, where we don't really have a populist, like charismatic leader, the AfD can gain up to 20% in elections. Hopefully not in 2 weeks' time, but it really, the potential is there. And I actually think that, and this is why I talked about the social roots of right-wing populism, I don't think it's just some messianic figure coming in and seducing people who otherwise would vote differently. I think there is a potential of communitarians. There is a market gap, a representation gap in a way. In most countries of about, and I'd put it at like between 15 and 25% in most countries of people who have the sense of being not represented, of wanting a populist party, or like being concerned about this identity divide. And then the question is, of course, to what extent are right-wing populists able to gather this, or to capitalize on this potential? And in that case, I think that the personality becomes important. But I don't think it's that there's a difference between cause and effect. It's like the potential is there in most countries. And the question, how easy it is to capitalize on that, is a mixture of factors within the party system, including the charisma of the person, but also, for instance, voting systems. So, for instance, in a country like Germany or the Netherlands or many other European countries that have proportionate representation, right-wing populists have their own party, and they usually don't end up in government because they have their own party that are like between 15 and 20%, and they are stuck there. Whereas in countries like the US, having a support base of 20 to 25%, if you go into the primaries, you can actually take over a major party, and then you have a completely different dynamic. But I actually would put the percentage of people who really resonate with this identity cleavage at relatively similar levels across most Western democracies.
Have you looked at the psychological drivers of those who support populists?
I have. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a moral psychologist or anything. And I do think we have to always be careful not to pathologize, like, or not to say like to medicalize a lot of these things. But for this, for instance, I would recommend in many ways reading Jonathan Haidt, who is much more articulate than I am. But for instance, one thing that is interesting, that is me just citing other research, I actually haven't done too much research on that, but is that those who vote for right-wing populist parties in many ways are more similar in their outlook and attitudes to those who before voted far-right parties or vote left-wing populist parties. In that, they have a much clearer idea of good and evil, of who's good and who's not. There's like a greater extent readiness for radicalism, and there's also greater pessimism about where the world is going. And it's actually really interesting because we traditionally tend to think that right-wing populists mainly gain their support from disaffected conservative voters. And in many European countries, at least, it's actually the contrary is the case, that a lot of conservative voters tend to be the most optimistic about the world, and the least radical, and the also in terms of like moral values, quite conservative. Whereas if you look at moral values, a lot of right-wing populists don't really care much in the electorate about moral traditionalism.
Okay, just one last question to round off the event. Do you think it's fair to suggest that religious or Christian sensibility in Europe tends to be aligned with gospel values, such as sensibility in the US is not?
I'm not sure I'd go that far. So one of the interesting things that I saw in my research was that because obviously a lot of, especially faith leaders I talked, got really excited when I told them that you have this religious vaccination and religious immunity, and that maybe there would be, it's like Christianity is like this silver bullet against populism or against authoritarianism or xenophobic attitudes. What is interesting is if you actually look at the attitudes among Christians in Western Europe and the Christians in the US, the attitudes, for instance, towards foreigners, towards democracy, is quite similar. So you also get in Western Europe a lot of Christians who are very much concerned about the arrival of Muslim immigrants and all of these things. But what is interesting is there's a gap of behavior between attitudes and voting. And I think that is actually in many ways the important thing, that many, again, European Christians might think, oh yeah, I'm kind of concerned about like foreigners coming to my country and I don't know what this country looks like anymore. But then they feel, okay, but my priest, my bishop, and all of these people tell me that I can't really vote for a far-right party, that this is the wrong answer, and that this sense of social taboos actually plays quite an important role in Europe. And I think I'd rather explain it with that. And we also actually shouldn't underestimate, it's very interesting, we think of these like white evangelical Christians as super reactionary or like xenophobic. But in many ways, they are actually, if you compare American like evangelical or Christian conservatives to American secular conservatives, the American Christian conservatives are much more radical and traditionalist when it comes to issues like abortion. But at the same time, they are much more open towards immigration. They are much more concerned about race relations. They're much more open. They're much more open towards working with other faith communities. There was, for instance, a Muslim Tea Party, and all of these things. So I think we shouldn't underestimate this aspect in there. The question is, how is this then expressed politically? And I think there we see a big difference, on the one hand due to the structure of church-state relations, and on the other hand due to the behavior of political parties. But also to say thank you, because I'm aware that we are out of time. But if you, I see that there are a lot of questions in the chat. I'll try to have a look at that, but you also have my email address on the presentation. So don't hesitate to get in touch if you have more questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time, Tobias, and it's been a really interesting event. And thank you for everyone for all your questions. It's been really great, and hopefully next year we'll be able to meet each other in person. But thank you. Have a good evening, everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody.